Is this a way to? Oh. Okay, perfect. Okay, so one of the most widely used paradigm to study such behavior is classical Pavlovian fear conditioning. And fear conditioning is a form of associative learning in which an aversive stimulus, such as, for example, an electric shock, is paired with a neutral stimulus, such as, for example, a tone. And as a consequence of this association, the neutral stimulus, the so-called conditioned stimulus, elicits a fear response because it serves as a cue that signals the presence of potential danger to the organism. How is this conditioned stimulus represented in the human brain? So recent meta-analysis of fMRI studies using fear conditioning tasks indicated that the presentation of this conditioned stimulus, threat-related cue, activates the salience network, a network that comprises subcortical and cortical regions such as dorsal anterior cingulate, anterior insula, thalamus, midbrain, and also ventral striatum. So having known that, here we explored whether the presentation of a threat-related stimulus leads not only to the activation of the insula of the salience network, but also subsequent activation present elsewhere in the brain. And if that was the case, that could potentially indicate that the threat-related information is represented not only in one particular network, but actually in a pattern of propagated activity across networks, meaning essentially that there is a complex brain dynamics that can be represented as a sequence of distinct activation patterns. And this is actually what we found. So we found consistent activation on a group level map throughout the whole brain over the period of 15 seconds after the onset of a threat-related cue. And this is represented here as a time course of active gray matter nodes. And this indicates that the activation of the salience network, to which I referred before, might be considered as an early event in a spatio-temporal cascade. So now I would like to take a moment to explain how we arrive at this conclusion and perhaps more importantly, what constitutes this late activation that we observe in the data. So in order to induce the association between an aversive stimulus and a neutral stimulus, we used an instructed delay conditioning task. In this task, 29 healthy participants were exposed to visual stimuli and informed that one of them would be paired with an electric shock. So as a consequence, the blue square served as a neutral cue, whereas the green square served as a threat-related cue, which was partially reinforced by a concurrent presentation of an electric shock. So as a consequence, we have 3 experimental conditions. And this manipulation was successful as it induced increased skin conductance response and an autonomic index of fear response to the presentation of a threat-related cue indicated here in the green bar. We also see that it's typical for this particular paradigm that the increased skin conductance response to this stimulus was relatively stable over trials. The structure of individual trials enabled us to look at the possibility of late activation as there was presentation of a stimulus for 4 seconds, followed by subsequent 12-second post-stimulus period. And now, due to time restrictions, I would like to focus mainly on the spatio-temporal pattern induced by only one experimental condition, which is the presentation of a threat-related cue alone without the shock. So in order to look how the activity evolves across space and time, we did the following in a voxel-wise manner. We estimated the bold response over 15 seconds epoch using GLM deconvolution. Subsequently, we look at each time point whether this bold amplitude was significantly different than the baseline, which is the mean across the run. And then if you repeat this procedure for every time point and for every voxel in the brain, you will be given a sequence of whole brain activation maps. And this is basically, so now I would like to show you the sequence of these maps. The representation that I use here is the following. So the cortex was projected to the surface, and we also additionally included subcortical structures relevant for the task, such as amygdala, hippocampus, putamen, coded and thalamus. At the bottom, you see the structure of a trial. And so the green bar at the bottom indicates the presentation of the stimulus. So now I will just simply start, and we see that around 5 seconds after the onset of a thread-related cue, we see a clear formation of salience network. So there is activation in the dorsal anterior cingulate, anterior insula, supramarginal gyrus. And also what we see that is typical in this paradigm is the deactivation in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. So if I continue now, we see that this pattern tends to disappear and another one is formed around 9 seconds after the stimulus onset. And this is dominated by the activation in the right dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and also dorsal putamen. Subsequently, we see an emergence of another pattern which is formed mainly by the activation of regions that belongs to the default mode network, which are ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, dorsomedial prefrontal cortex extending to the lateral part. We also see angular gyrus, and interestingly, there is a rebound of activation in the amygdala. So the sequence of these maps essentially show that there is a sequential activation that sort of goes through 3 networks. And I would like to illustrate this again, but in a much more compact way. So to do it, I use parcellation of resting state networks provided by Johan colleagues, and I focus on 3 of them: salience, frontoparietal, and the default mode, which are represented here in these color-coded blocks at the bottom. So what these blocks represent is that their columns are time points from the stimulus onset, and rows are nodes that belong to these particular 3 networks. And what I'm going to do now, I'm going to indicate in black those nodes and their respective time points when they were active. So what we see here is that the nodes of the salience network are predominantly activated early, whereas the nodes of the default mode networks are active late. And we also see that there is some sort of intermediate activation of some nodes of the frontoparietal cognitive control network. I didn't have time to show you all these maps for other conditions, so if I repeat the same procedure for a neutral cue, what we observe is the following: is a pattern dominated by early activation. So if I flip now between the 2, you see sort of a qualitative difference. And we also confirm that difference by looking at direct contrast between the amplitudes at each time points between these 2 conditions. Therefore, I conclude that in this particular task, the presentation of a thread-related cue triggered coordinated brain activity that unfolded from salience to default mode regions. And I would like to finish with a speculation what actually this pattern, this spatio-temporal pattern, might indicate. So in line with the hypothesized role of the default mode network in processing more abstract representation, I propose that this sort of continual that this pattern that we observe might reflect continual elaboration of thread-related information beyond the low-level automatic associations that we previously typically associate with the activation of the salience network. And this might include, for example, the knowledge about the contingencies, the knowledge of contingencies about the stimuli in the environment. So I would like to thank my collaborators, especially those who shared with me their data. And if you find this research relevant for your work, I would be happy to collaborate. And I'm also looking forward to the poster session this afternoon when I could show more data, more analysis, and also discuss in more detail the potential implications of the results. Thanks.